welcome everyone, and thank you very much to the Orion Policy Institute for hosting this webinar on transnational repression. My name is Yana Gorokhovskaia. I am the Research Director for Strategy and Design at Freedom House. Freedom House is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, US-based organization that has done some work on transnational repression over the last 2 years, including 2 reports. And I am very glad to be here. I will be making some remarks, but also moderating this panel. And I will do a quick round of introductions, and then I will ask one of our panelists to start us off. So with us today, we have Marcus Michaelsen. Marcus is a researcher who has worked very extensively on digital transnational repression and also repression that is perpetrated by some of the states in the MENA region. We have Dana Moss, who is sort of the originator of the term transnational repression, who has done also work on transnational repression with diasporas from the MENA region in the United States and elsewhere, and has a great book that is behind her that she can point to. We have Mathieu Deflem, who is going to be speaking about the role of Interpol in transnational repression. Mathieu is a sociologist who's done work on some of the diasporas we're talking about. And finally, last but not least, we have Ed Lemon. Ed has done quite a bit of work on transnational repression. In addition to being a professor, Ed is also leading the Oxus Society, which has issued some reports on repression of Uyghurs. And Ed has done work on transnational repression as facilitated by international organizations. And I understand that's what he'll be speaking about today. So with that, each of our speakers will be given about 10 to 12 minutes, and I will turn it over to Marcus to begin.
Okay, thank you very much. Also to the Orion Policy Institute for giving us this opportunity, and thank you, Yana, for the introduction. I'm glad to start this off. I will try to share my screen. Okay, let me know if this works. Good. So in my intervention, I will talk mainly about digital transnational repression. So the ways authoritarian regimes use digital technologies to control and silence dissent across borders. And I thought to start this presentation or this contribution with this iconic image of dictatorship, which often still influences the way we think about authoritarian regimes. So the dictator behind walls, in a fenced-off territory, strictly limiting the movement of people, ideas, with border controls and censorship and propaganda. And this image was never really accurate, but it is, especially today with globalization, it is not really accurate anymore, because authoritarian regimes are embedded in a global system, in complex international relations, and they had to find responses to the cross-border flows of people and ideas. So people who leave their country today for political or economic reasons stay connected to their homeland, and they can easily participate in its political and social affairs. And digital technologies, of course, enable exiled journalists, human rights defenders, activists to have a voice from outside, from afar, to mobilize for political change in their home country and to raise international awareness on rights violations. And obviously, authoritarian regimes perceive these external influences as a threat. And in response, they try to control the activities of their populations abroad. And what I want to highlight here in my contribution is that digital technologies are an essential component of all forms of transnational repression. So the very same technologies that allow exiles and diasporas to stay involved in their home country affairs also help regimes to reach across borders. Transnational activists heavily rely on digital communications and social media, and this use exposes them to attacks and threats from home state agents. So yeah, what are the tools of digital transnational repression? So first, these technologies allow for easier monitoring and surveillance. So agents can collect so-called open source intelligence, information on campaigns and interviews of activists, their friends, networks, and travels, their participation in conferences. And this information can be used against them to prepare further attacks or threats. And in more aggressive forms of targeted surveillance, regime agents try to gain access to the accounts and devices of activists, to their correspondence and confidential data, by hacking into their accounts and devices. And a common form of such attacks are phishing messages, where the perpetrators send out a compromised link or attachment, and once the target person clicks on it, they will get access to her account or device. And perpetrators use often information that they have gathered online for social engineering to lure targets into clicking on these links. For instance, we have seen invitations to seminars, interview requests, or similar messages that are really tailored to the target person. And the malware that they use in these attacks can be very simple, like using the tools of cybercrime, but increasingly it is also that advanced and very expensive commercial spyware is put into use against targets in civil society. So in the Middle East, we have countries in the Gulf region like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who have the resources to purchase sophisticated spyware, and such as the Pegasus surveillance technology, which is produced by the Israeli NSO group. And this tool allows actually to infiltrate phones without that the target person even needs to click on any link. And Saudi Arabia has used Pegasus against the associates of Jamal Khashoggi, who was then later brutally murdered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Another form of digital transnational repression is online harassment, smear campaigns, and trolling. So regime agents will use false and distorted information, verbal threats, and abuse against activists to intimidate them, put them under pressure, or taint their reputation. Government trolls can also manipulate online debates on social media to drown criticism, or file false reports against social media profiles of dissidents to get them blocked or closed. And this also highlights the responsibilities of the big digital platforms. So Iranian authorities have reportedly tried to bribe content moderators for Instagram, based in Germany, to block critical content and accounts on the social network. And Saudi Arabia has succeeded to infiltrate Twitter with 2 agents who then collected sensitive information on dissidents and using the network. So with this toolkit of transnational repression, regime agents are able to pressure activists into self-censorship, to undermine their ties to the home country, and to put them under tension and stress. So in my interviews with Iranian or Syrian activists, they were often uncertain about how systematic and coordinated this monitoring is. And many assumed that surveillance was comprehensive and permanent. And this has, of course, a chilling effect. So respondents told me that they refrain from certain activities like media appearances, participation in public protests, or panel discussions. And because of potential surveillance, they also reduced their ties to colleagues and relatives in the home country. And this means they get less information out of the country. So journalists have less contacts with their sources. Human rights defenders have more difficulties to collect information on rights violations. And finally, the threats of targeted surveillance and online harassment also take a psychological toll on activists. So many report on anxiety and paranoia, feelings of isolation, burnout, and insecurity. And these effects are highlighted in a fantastic report by our colleagues at the Citizen Lab, which is based on research with targets of digital transnational repression in Canada. So through these digital threats, regimes are able to intervene in activists' everyday life and in their routines, and they can constrain some of the dynamics, impacts, and outreach of diaspora activism. And digital threats are often also intertwined with other forms of transnational repression. So most prominently, or especially, the combination of monitoring and surveillance with threats against families in the home country, what we call proxy punishment, is a very effective method to silence entire diaspora communities. So I will leave it at that, and I suppose that we will probably come to possible remedies and mitigation strategies in the discussion. Yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Marcus. Yeah, and you read my mind. I'm very interested in talking about what some possible solutions are, and also lifting the burden of dealing with digital repression from the activists and the targets themselves. I think there's a lot of discussion about digital hygiene and the importance of digital hygiene, but obviously that can only go so far, especially if you're being targeted by something sophisticated like spyware. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dana.
Okay, great. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint here. If I can, it's not appearing. Sorry, bear with me one second. All right, here we go. So my talk is going to be echoing a lot of what Marcus has said, but I'll try not to be too repetitive. Sorry, we practiced this before, but the best laid plans. Okay, here we go. All right, hopefully give me a thumbs up. Everybody can see okay? Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the findings of my book, but trying to paint, again, like as Marcus has done, a general overview of the problem that we're all facing with transnational repression, especially diaspora communities, and give you some examples from my fieldwork with the Syrian and Libyan community. I think that it's clear at this point, hopefully it's becoming clear anyway, that transnational repression, in large part thanks to our colleagues at Freedom House, Citizen Lab, and other independent researchers, Mathieu, Marcus, Ed, and many others, that regimes' attempts to control and coerce and punish their diasporas is a growing global threat. We know that the repertoire of transnational repression, of course, includes digital forms like Marcus talked about, also assassinations, violent attacks. We've seen a lot of kidnappings, forced renditions, and coerced return back home. So people might be threatened that something will happen to their families if they don't return home for persecution or trial or detention. A lot of diaspora members face threats. They do so online, they do so in person. And for women, these tend to be very sexualized and extremely scary. There's a lot of propaganda and slander that is being perpetrated by authoritarian regimes against activists. And it tends to be very effective when they're accused of terrorism, because this perks up the ears of security agencies and their host societies and often puts them under suspicion for doing something wrong when they haven't done. Oftentimes, global campaigns like the Chinese Communist Party's global campaign against corruption is used as a label to slander and target human rights activists, journalists, and pro-democracy persons. People are also accused of espionage, prostitution, disloyalty, all sorts of things, and this has a major effect on their reputation, their safety abroad. As Marcus mentioned, we also have this very scary phenomenon going on of proxy punishment. So people's relatives at home, oftentimes people who are not involved in any way, shape, or form in activism are actually being incarcerated, disappeared, intimidated, and actually used as tools to try to silence diaspora members abroad. And then we have surveillance, we have hacking. Now, when I was observing Syrian American protests against the Assad regime in Southern California, I not only heard stories about people feeling that they were surveilled online and having evidence of this, but also there were people who were in the pro-Assad contingency who were actively surveilling them, intimidating them, and recording their activities with the intention of sending that information back to the Syrian intelligence. We also know that regimes are preventing mobility or trying to control it. They're imposing exile on people. Oftentimes they're confiscating relatives' passports. Students face a threat of withdrawal of scholarships if they don't, celebrate the regime or act as if they are loyal. And we also see the confiscation of diaspora activists and their family members' property back in the home country. So this is a huge repertoire of repressive, globalized authoritarianism that reaches into every continent of the globe. And it's unfortunately a repertoire that in my review of the literature seems to be ever expanding as authoritarian regimes learn new ways to try to control their diaspora populations. Just to summarize the report of my fabulous colleagues, the Freedom House report, Out of Sight but Not Out of Reach, has done some of the best comparative work in terms of looking at the scope of this problem. And in terms of forms of direct violence and kidnappings, attempted assassinations, basically things we can measure, between 2014 and 2020, there were a whopping 608 documented cases of transnational repression occurring across 79 different host countries. So as we can see, even the small slice of transnational repressive acts that we can measure and we can know for sure that they were transnational repression, it's happening across the globe. I do want to mention the caveat that this is not exclusive to authoritarian regimes. My colleagues and I tend to talk a lot about authoritarian regime repression, but it's also facilitated by other actors. As Marcus mentioned, we have corporations engaged in launching spyware that's very sophisticated, that's a very unregulated market. And regimes are obtaining this both legally and illegally to spy on dissidents abroad. And it also in times involves collaboration with other host countries, both authoritarian regimes. So let's say when China collaborates with Thailand to render Chinese dissidents or Hong Kong dissidents back to the mainland, but also it has in the past and currently involved cooperation with democracies. And we particularly see this, and I'm just skipping ahead because I want to mention, the more anti-immigrant a country is, the more likely they are to act on an Interpol red notice, or the more likely they are to prevent diasporas from being safe. So this is mutually reinforcing. And then I also want to mention too that Fiona Adamson has done some fabulous work showing that transnational repression can be perpetuated by non-state actors, including insurgent groups like Tamil Eelam from Sri Lanka and criminal networks. But the actors with the most capacity to impact diaspora activists are definitely states and authoritarian regimes. So that's why we tend to focus on that. This is not a new problem, but it is a growing problem. As Marcus mentioned, we have advancing technologies and sort of the fruits of globalization that make our cross communications ever faster and easier and cheaper are also being used by authoritarian regimes and being deployed against activists. And then we also have this situation where democracies, even those that are very well-intentioned and want to counter this practice, are very much on the back foot in terms of what to do about it. And international institutions also sometimes condemn what's happening. The European Parliament recently mentioned that, China is not just targeting the Uyghurs in China, but globally, right? And so we need to pay attention to this. However, those institutions oftentimes lack teeth to enforce any sort of sanction. So in terms of policy response, which I do also hope we'll talk about later, we have a very weak policy response that needs a lot more teeth, and it needs a lot more multilateral cooperation at this point. It's worth mentioning why regimes engage in transnational repression. I mean, part of it is because diasporas include these troublemakers, right? People have been forced into exile, people who are critical of those regimes, like human rights activists and journalists. And as my work documents, these diaspora activists have the potential to really make a difference. They can lobby against regimes, they launch protests, counter propaganda, and they bring human rights abuses to the world's attention, and they can support humanitarian aid delivery and other sort of crisis support, as we saw like Syrian Americans doing, for example, during the Syrian Revolution. But diasporas also include groups who are viewed by regimes as potential threats. So diasporas don't have to be active in order to face this repression. A lot of times regimes view diaspora control as part and parcel to their survival and their legitimacy. So they feel they feel compelled to surveil and try to control what international students do and laborers do and this sort of thing, so that they don't become a problem later. So entire diaspora communities are subjected to transnational repression, not just elite exiles or people who are necessarily active. And it's important also to note, I think, that transnational regimes, just ideologically, a lot of times view diaspora members as their subjects who are required to demonstrate loyalty. And this can even extend to people who are citizens of other countries and people who were born abroad. So second generation, for example, Eritreans, Rwandans, or Syrians are still expected to toe the party line when it comes to anything regarding their home country. So in this way, we see that this is a huge problem. Obviously, when diasporas are subjected to violence and threats or the potential of being surveilled, this can prevent them from exercising their basic human rights, the civil liberties that they're granted when they move to democracies, and their political rights. And it can very severely punish them for doing so. For host country states, this undermines national security, it undermines the rule of law, and it undermines democracy as a practice. I would also argue that it continues to fuel and be folded into ethnocentrism, global racism, and xenophobia, which has a lot to do with the war on terror, has a lot to do with global northern countries trying to keep people out from the global south. And that's something we can discuss later if anyone's interested. So this is a big part of the rise of global authoritarianism, the democracy recession that we're facing right now. And I'll just give you a few examples from my fieldwork. I always remind people about the Arab Spring, which happened in 2011 because my students were in middle school when this happened. And in any case, it swept across the region, hitting a lot of the major countries and leading to uprisings, some of which had temporary successes and some of which didn't. But nevertheless, at the beginning of the Syrian uprising, when protests were just few and far between and starting to simmer in that country, a Syrian pianist named Malik Jandali performed at a concert in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And in that concert, he called for liberty and freedom in his homeland. He did not criticize the regime. He was not known as an activist. But what happened is his family members, his elderly parents in the city of Homs, were kidnapped, they were beaten up, and they were told by security forces, we're going to teach you how to raise your son. And so de facto, in this case, not only was this unusual in the fact that it was publicized on CNN and elsewhere, but it also sent a chilling effect to the rest of the diaspora to remind them that the kinds of freedom of speech that they could deploy abroad in the service of basic human rights principles could be leveraged against their families at home. So I found that prior to the Arab Spring, transnational repression as a threat propagated fear and mistrust and division. As Nabal told me, and I won't read all these quotes, but as Nabal told me, the regime really made us fear each other because you don't know who works for the regime. A lot of times the regime, in order to allow people to travel abroad, forced them to spy on each other, write reports on each other, and inform on each other. So even though, just as within a totalitarian state, how everybody is seen as a potential threat or informant, a lot of times this travels abroad as well. Another effect was that, again, this really limited folks' free speech and civic life, even within the confines of their homes. Ayman said, we'd never be able to speak in front of Syrians who are affiliated with the regime if we were at a gala or a party or some sort of community event, because we were very afraid for ourselves, because we were going regularly back home or for our family back home. And I also found that even though there were some Syrian associations that had been established in the United States and Britain prior to 2011, these were really viewed as part of the authoritarian infrastructure. So when anybody tried to organize an independent group to, for example, talk about reform, political reform in Syria, Hussam told me everyone was afraid to join. We tried to form the Syrian American Council, but they were afraid to join because the consequences could be very severe if you were visiting Syria, and the intelligence might visit your family members. So this really made independent organizing, even to discuss politics back home, a very difficult and dangerous thing. And I was told repeatedly, you couldn't operate independently of the Syrian government. If their people weren't in charge of your association in the United States, you would be intimidated, you could be harassed, family members could be hurt. It wasn't going to happen. Another effect was that this really constrained exile activism. So there were people abroad who had been severely repressed and harmed back in the home country and had fled and escaped abroad and become refugees. But the problem is that when you were publicly open about your anti-regime sentiment, other people were afraid to associate with you because being publicly anti-regime was fringe. People were worried you'd be incriminated by association, that someone would view you consorting with the enemy, so to speak, and again, harm you or harm your family. And so opposition groups, although they tend to exist, I think, for every authoritarian home country abroad, a lot of times they're forced underground, they lack support, and they're really viewed as fringe groups. And Firas told me, who came out very vehemently in favor of the revolution once it happened, he said, back then you stayed away from this opposition because they're being observed. It makes sense. And Hamid, who was the son of a longtime anti-Gaddafi revolutionary, said even when he tried to talk to his friends about this, they'd say a lot of Libyans were scared. If I say, hey, Gaddafi this, everybody was like, shut up, dude, I can't even hang around you. So there were no public anti-regime organizations or lobbies that existed in these diasporas before 2011, besides a few websites here or a few small groups here, but they really weren't allowed to be public and they weren't able to gain a membership. So what I find is that, and you can read about this in my book if you like, that major crises and conflicts in the home country can disrupt, at least temporarily, these deterrent effects. So when things in Syria got really contentious, people were being brutally murdered for demanding, the end of corruption, political reform. A lot of Syrians abroad did decide to come out. A lot of Libyans abroad did decide to do so. And they felt obligated to do that because so many people at home were doing so. We also find my research with Marcus and others, Jillian Kennedy, who isn't here today, also finds that regime critics and exiles who have a strong commitment and a lot of social support, institutional support, economic resources, are more likely to resist the silencing effects of transnational repression. So the point of this is, I don't mean to suggest that diasporas sort of never confront or can overcome the effects of transnational repression. They can, but it's very, very difficult. It tends to be fleeting, it tends to be temporary, and without the means to offset the cost of this repression, diaspora members usually choose to be silent or self-censor. And today, the Syrian diaspora is again under threat. The Assad regime has been once again readmitted to Interpol last year, which Mathieu and Ed know a lot about. Activists have been attacked and killed on the European continent. And in fact, they're still to this day, over 10 years after the uprising started, afraid sometimes to testify in terms of war crimes that happened to them. And so the diaspora writ large has really been in some ways forced back into a state of silence. So this empowerment that a lot of people felt during the Arab Spring was very much fleeting. So my final points, because I know we're short on time, is that I want to emphasize that diasporas really play a critical role in supporting democratization efforts, human rights efforts, contributing to humanitarian aid and development. But that transnational repression, again, as Marcus said, is really an effective countermeasure in demobilizing them. And even when they do come out, even when they do have a lot of capital and commitment and desire to absorb the costs of whatever happens, there's no guarantee of their safety. So if you like, you can read more about these effects in some of the work that I've done. Sapira Furstenberg and I have a forthcoming volume featuring Marcus, Ed, and many others called Transnational Repression in the Age of Globalization, where we cite Freedom House, Citizen Lab, all of our wonderful colleagues doing important work. So keep your eyes open for that. And if you need any resources and you don't have access, please just shoot me an email. I'm at Notre Dame in the Department of Sociology. So thank you all for having us, and I'll turn it over now. Thanks.
Thanks, Diana. And thanks so much for the shout out to Freedom House. Our, I don't know, positive or negative news, our database was updated this year. So we're up to 735 incidents now with 36 perpetrator countries across 84 states in the world. So obviously a growing problem. And I will also second your point about the problem of borders and migration. One thing that we looked at was that, we see more cases in authoritarian states because of the ease with which autocrats cooperate, but also partly because people often flee to where they can, right? Which is sometimes a neighbor country, or a country that will allow you to come in. And so we see, lots of Belarusians were targeted in Russia this past year. We saw certain other events in Turkey, which I'll talk about that as well. And so the right to asylum is a big part of fighting back against transnational repression. So with that, I will turn it over to Mathieu for his presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me share my screen. Do you see my screen? Yes? Yes, you're all seeing it? Okay, thank you. So I'm going to tap into what some of Michael and has been said before, particularly in terms of, which I thought was a very interesting point, in terms of the factual embeddedness of authoritarian regimes in a global structure. And obviously, Interpol is one of the instruments, if you will, of that embeddedness, and a very practical and in some sense a very effective instrument as well. Now, because I generally find that there's still a lot of confusion about what Interpol is and where Interpol has come from and what the organization is meant to be. Versus, on the other hand, it is nowadays well known that Interpol has been abused by authoritarian regimes. This is actually just a little Google search that I did this morning. But sadly, if you Google anything in the likes of Interpol plus repression, or in this case, Interpol plus authoritarian, you find a lot of news sources. So in other words, this is being discussed quite a lot. It hasn't reached sociological and criminological research yet to the point that I think it deserves. But to some extent, of course, I would also say it is almost, well, a little bit, it's maybe a too strong a word, but it's almost a little bit banal to say that authoritarian regimes are not only authoritarian in terms of their ideology and their beliefs, but also in their conduct, in what they do. That's what an authoritarian regime is. It acts in authoritarian ways. So in that sense, it will use any means at its disposal, like Michael said, digital, or by targeting people in diaspora, or indeed, as in this case, by relying on an international instrument of law enforcement. So rather than going into specific cases on which, quite frankly, I am not an expert, but there have been very, very good reports available lately, particularly coming from some working groups in the European Union. And so a lot of information is out there about how authoritarian regimes use Interpol. What I find interesting, and what I'm going to talk about is how does this make sense, or not, of course, in terms of the context itself of Interpol as an international law enforcement organization and its objectives and its history. So basically, what authoritarian regimes do in terms of Interpol is they take advantage of the international communications systems to track down political opponents and to target them as criminals. So we have a criminalization of political dissent. Now, if we look at the origins and the history of Interpol, it is actually very, very counter to the mission of Interpol itself. Not only that authoritarian regimes are trying to do this, but that presently, I would argue, the Interpol leadership, and indeed the members of Interpol, are not doing nearly enough to counter that and to hold on to the principles of their own organization. So let me give you a little bit of an overview. Interpol was founded in 1923 in Vienna, so only a few years after the end of World War I, as the International Criminal Police Commission. It was set up very explicitly as a cooperative organization among the police of different countries, and it is therefore not a supranational agency. So there is no such thing as an Interpol police official or an Interpol cop. Instead, it is a cooperative agreement among criminal law enforcement agencies, and that is very important too, because originally, as some of you may know from my historical work in my book, Policing World Society, in the 19th century, the earliest efforts to organize international police cooperation were distinctly political, were meant for tracking down political opponents, basically, which in those days were basically Democrats, didn't even have to be anarchist or communist. But over the course of historical development, the police profession became more bureaucratized and professionalized itself in terms of a focus exclusively on criminal law enforcement, or what was called in those days ordinary crimes. Now, at the same time, as well, very soon after Interpol, then called the International Criminal Police Commission, was established in the 1920s, the political world, the wider political world, of course, also has an influence on this objective of remaining, let's say, a purely practical organization. And most tragically, of course, was the Nazification of Interpol, which was sadly, as you can imagine, brought about very quickly and very smoothly, because the Interpol headquarters were located in Vienna, Austria. Austria gets annexed. The Nazis devise a plan to first install an Austrian Nazi, of whom it was known that he was severely ill, so he would soon die. So then a German Nazi could take over, and then the Interpol headquarters were moved to Berlin. All in all, there is no reason to assume that the organization wasn't, completely inactive and dormant during World War II. Therefore, after World War II, the organization had to be reestablished, and that actually took place at a meeting in Brussels, in Belgium. And then it became, Interpol had the name change to the International Criminal Police Organization, which today is still part of the official designation. The addition of the term Interpol came about in 1956. The headquarters were then, of course, moved away from Germany, Austria, to initially to Paris, and then since the late 1980s to Lyon, where they are still today. Quickly looking at the second half of the 20th century, we again have multiple incidents of, let's say, the neutrality and the practical nature of Interpol being very difficult to maintain in the light of political influences. First of all, we have the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, meant that Eastern communist countries, Eastern European communist countries, could again take advantage of the Interpol communications network. One such case occurred in the late 1950s. It was a request from police of Czechoslovakia, then Czechoslovakia, and it turned out to be, wanted notice for these international criminals, and they actually turned out to be fugitives from the communist regime, and they were granted asylum in West Germany. That led the FBI, then still the official member of Interpol, to withdraw from the organization, since when actually in the United States the Treasury Department took over, and since more recently it's a combined effort of Treasury and Justice again. In 1956, Interpol made the non-political nature of its organization more explicit in the form of the now famous Article 3, which is often invoked in discussions today. Whenever there's a case of an authoritarian regime trying to track somebody down on the basis of Interpol, they say, isn't this in violation of Article 3 of your own institution, which indeed prohibits any intervention or activities of a political, military, religious, or racial character. Now, in the years thereafter, every now and then there were still, it came to light. I think, of course, that to some extent there were probably more cases that we don't know about, but there were also sometimes obvious frictions of a political nature that had effects on Interpol, for instance, on where the General Assembly, which is the annual meeting of Interpol, could be held. And sometimes, countries would raise objections. No, we cannot do it there. And then if you're going to organize it there, we will not attend, and so on and so forth. There's an interesting case actually in terms of the membership of Taiwan and China. Presently, China is a member of Interpol, but police from Taiwan is not. And there are oftentimes calls for Taiwan to become a member. Interestingly, China had actually left Interpol in the 1940s, I believe. And then from about the 1960s through the 1980s, Taiwan was a member of Interpol. Then China stepped in again, and that voided the membership of Taiwan. Another famous or infamous, I should say, case was the Interpol presidency of Boltikov in the late 1960s, early 1970s, who turned out to have been a Nazi official and who actually much later, I think as recent as 15 or 20 years ago, turned out to have been working for the CIA. Another problem was that Interpol initially did not consider cases of terrorism because it said that terrorism was inevitably a political issue that has changed since the 1980s, and obviously even more so since the 1990s and after 2011. Now, at the same time, when all this happens, the Interpol leadership is still and has been, and in my opinion, has been way too much interested in seeking to broaden its membership and in seeking to present itself as, look, we are one of the very largest international organizations in the world. And presently, Interpol represents police from 195 countries. And I think that in itself, that emphasis on broadening the membership has come at the expense of holding on to the mission, the very reason why Interpol exists, which is to foster international cooperation on criminal matters. And maybe I can tell you, it makes sense. It is really rational, and it's even, I would say, advisable at some moments, on some occasions, for some cases, for the police of a democratic nation to cooperate with the police of an authoritarian regime, for instance, in the case of a very severe international crime. For instance, if we think about the International Organization of Prostitution, international human rights trafficking, international police officers, they can deal with some very, very serious, very problematic issues, child pornography, pedophile rings, and so on. So let's say, if you're a cop in the United States and you know that there is a suspect who is involved in international pedophilia or child pornography, something really gruesome like that, and they fled to China, you're not going to say, well, I don't want to cooperate with police from China. So obviously, the nature of the crime means that you will do it. On the other hand, if those authoritarian regimes are involved in the Interpol communication system too, then where do you draw the line in reciprocating that cooperation by also partaking in tracking down political refugees, for instance? And first of all, so this is the first form of abuse, that is trying to track down members of the diaspora, the activist diaspora, as criminals. Here are some of the countries. I sometimes put the name of a person in front of it: Putin's Russia, Erdogan's Turkey, Maduro's Venezuela, and so on, for obvious reasons, communist China, and so on, that have been discovered and reported to have been involved in trying to track down political opponents through Interpol. However, there is also a second way, and that is, of course, by virtue of the very participation of members of an authoritarian regime in Interpol itself, and they're trying to acquire a more significant role, for instance, specifically by taking up leadership positions. There's a famous case, at least two famous cases. One was Interpol President Meng Hongwei from China. He was president of Interpol until 2018 for 2 years, who then suddenly, the Interpol headquarters were told, was resigning. And then it actually turned out that he had been arrested in China, and he was subsequently convicted and imprisoned. And his wife actually has been very vocal about that case. Then the political nature of that didn't stop, because immediately thereafter, one of the leading candidates for the presidency was apparently a Putin candidate, so to speak, right? Not just a Russian candidate, but a Putin Russian candidate. And that issue was avoided by choosing a South Korean. Sadly, and very astonishingly, in the fall of 2021, a representative, a general actually, of the United Arab Emirates was selected as president of Interpol, elected even as president of Interpol, despite the fact that there were serious allegations of torture against him. These allegations, very ironically, were so serious that the French authorities have formally opened an inquiry against him, making it, in other words, possible for the president of Interpol to be arrested as soon as he visits the Interpol headquarters, which are located in France. I also note that United Arab Emirates had donated almost half of the Interpol budget to the organization. So you see, there's a lot of politicking going on within Interpol that is obviously not helping the case. What are some of the conditions and objectives of this abuse? First of all, there are important conditions, and that is this. When we talk about police, we have to understand what it means. In the context of a democratic capitalist country, police has emerged from, but clearly separated itself from military and usually from political associations. Actually, and the problem becomes, how do police, military, and intelligence, for instance, cooperate? In terms of authoritarian regimes, political and criminal enforcement goals are basically the same. They're completely merged. So that's a condition. The objectives, I think, are at least twofold, and I think it's fairly important. So one obvious objective is you try to track down political opponents by calling them criminals and treating them accordingly. But I would say there's a second important objective, and I think Michael has touched on it too, and that is that authoritarian regimes also, by the process of this criminalization, seek to have themselves accepted as viable partners in international world affairs. And so, in other words, it's at least an attempt to be seen as respectable, you know, like, just like you, we are interested in this international crime problem. And I would actually argue, if an organization like Interpol and its members, to the extent that it tolerates these kind of activities, I would say it is also actually legitimating those activities. Now, briefly, in terms of actions and recommendations, we can talk about this maybe better during the Q&A, but I can say that Interpol has set up within itself a commission for the control of Interpol files. But of course, my argument is, well, whatever you set up internally will have limited relevance. So here you can see, indeed, this was quite in the news in France, was the election of an Interpol president who's accused of torture. And here you can also see any source that you look for, Google or YouTube, it's really been in the news a lot. So I think it is really worthy of serious scholarly attention. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathieu. I think especially important is a comment that you started with, which is the idea that authoritarianism is more than an ideology, it's also a set of practices. I think when we think about transnational repression, at least for me, at the heart of it, it's very much about treating individuals as subjects of power rather than as citizens. And so citizens have rights and subjects of power experience repression, essentially. I think it's despite all the very good work that's been done on Interpol, it's, you know, I still see a lot of references to so-called international arrest warrants, you know, the confusion around how to treat Interpol red notices. Last year, we had a couple of notable cases. One was the detention of Idris Hassan in Morocco, who is a Uyghur who fled Turkey, and he was able to combat several Interpol notices in Turkey, but then he landed in Morocco and was arrested and is awaiting return to China. There was also a Belarusian activist who was actually on a humanitarian visa in Poland who was briefly detained on a red notice. And the Polish authorities, when asked about this, said, it's our practice to detain people who are subjected to red notices. So I think this is a continuing problem. And I think your broader point about contestation of positions and norms at international institutions is extremely important. I was just at a workshop recently where the point was made that for autocrats, international institutions are a matter of survival, they're existential. For democracies, they're sort of they're a luxury. We tend to treat them as a luxury. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ed, who I believe will talk a little bit about regional organizations.
Thank you, Yana, and thank you to the organizers of today's workshop. I'm going to build off what Mathieu has just been talking about. And instead of talking about Interpol, an organization that has amongst its members democracies and non-democracies, I'm going to talk instead about authoritarian regional organizations and how they can facilitate transnational repression. So as we know, transnational repression, in order to be enacted, in order to target opponents living abroad, members of the diaspora, authoritarian regimes rarely do so alone. They have to rely upon, in most cases, bilateral or multilateral cooperation with local governments or through regional organizations. And so my focus is on the post-Soviet space, the countries of Eurasia, and I'm going to talk in particular about two organizations, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that counts as its members, the Central Asian Republics plus Russia, China, India, and Pakistan, and the Commonwealth of Independent States, which counts many of the post-Soviet republics as its member. And so authoritarian regional organizations, in contrast to more democratic regional organizations, they're built around the codification of authoritarian norms, rules that bypass human rights and facilitate swift extraditions and bolster regime protections in an effort to achieve what Roy Allison has called protective integration, i.e. they support their members by enforcing regime stability and authority. This can be through material practices, for example, the intervention of the Collective Security Treaty Organization in Kazakhstan at the beginning of this year to intervene to prop up and some would argue save the regime of Tokayev, the president of Kazakhstan, who was facing mass protests at the time, or by providing more normative, symbolic, rhetorical assistance to the members of these organizations, supporting and putting out statements in support of their counterterrorism operations, establishing new norms of regional security, stability, and counterterrorism, and in some cases actually granting extraterritorial powers to law enforcement to physically go into the jurisdiction of members of an international organization, bypassing traditional domestic legal checks and international norms, and extradite, or more accurately render and take back members of the diaspora, migrant or exile communities in those countries. Authoritarian regional organizations often form a platform, much like Interpol, for sharing information about suspects and conducting joint investigations against individuals who are deemed threatening. And so ultimately, this is a regional security system that privileges security cooperation, regime security over any concerns over individual human rights or the countries in obligations to international human rights law or norms. It puts regimes, opponents, journalists, and other civil society members at risk. And so this is what I'm talking about today is based on a chapter that will be published in the edited volume, edited by Dana and Saipira Furstenberg, that will hopefully be coming out in the coming months or maybe next year. And in that chapter, I look both at Interpol and at authoritarian regional organizations. But as I said, because Mathieu has already covered Interpol, I'll just talk about the Commonwealth of Independent States and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and how they have facilitated transnational repression in the regions broadly of Eurasia. So the CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, established in 1992 as an effort by Russia in particular to hold together the former Soviet region in an effort to maintain ties and to facilitate what's been called a civilized divorce between the constituent members of the Soviet Union, with the exception of the Baltic states that, of course, never recognized Soviet rule and viewed it as an occupation. And so ultimately, it's an organization that's existed now for 30 years, but it's experienced mixed fortunes and has been labeled by most analysts as being an ineffective organization at doing what its stated intention to do is to boost trade or boost cooperation between the members. But one area where cooperation has been relatively successful is in the field of transnational repression. So they've enacted a series of conventions that facilitate extradition, the so-called Minsk Convention, formerly the Convention on Legal Assistance and Legal Relations in Civil, Family and Criminal Matters, facilitates extradition between member states of the Commonwealth of Independent States. And this document makes no mention of the principle of non-refoulement, the international legal principle that you shouldn't send individuals back to countries where they could be mistreated or tortured, which is used in many asylum cases in more democratic countries as an argument against deporting individuals, refugees, and in granting them refugee or asylum in those countries. And so it doesn't make mention of this. Instead, we have accusations of someone's criminal background, criminal intent being taken at face value, and diplomatic assurances being taken as guarantees that the torture will not be used against the individual if they're returned to that country. So we see the establishment of a convention that bypasses, contravenes norms of international humanitarian law. We also see counterterrorism cooperation, and as in many authoritarian and non-authoritarian states, we see counterterrorism as at the forefront of many of the abuses of human rights and at the forefront of the justification for transnational repression, both by democracies and non-democracies. And here, the Commonwealth of Independent States is certainly no different. We see the establishment of an agreement on cooperation in the fight against terrorism, which envisages intelligence sharing, streamlined extraditions, extraterritorial policing, legal harmonization, joint trainings between the member states, between law enforcement bodies in the member states. And we've seen that codified in the establishment of an anti-terrorism center, which, amongst other things, has a centralized list of terrorists, which includes now 10,000 individuals on its list. So much like Interpol's database of red notices and diffusions that alert members to an individual, the accusations against them and requests for them to be arrested, the CIS has its own list of those accused of terrorism. It's also made efforts to harmonize legislation and standardize understandings of terrorism and extremism, publishing over 600 model laws through the CIS. And in some separate research I've done with colleagues as part of a project funded by the Baltic Sea Foundation in Sweden, we looked at putting these laws into a plagiarism checker that we would use as professors to check whether our students had copied and pasted sections of their essays from somewhere like Wikipedia. And what we found is that the Russian law on terrorism is, unsurprisingly, 42% of the text is verbatim the same as the CIS model law that was agreed upon and published by the CIS Interparliamentary Assembly that harmonizes legislation. Kyrgyzstan's law is 38% the same, and Tajikistan's law is 29% the same. So their terrorism laws are harmonized, their understandings of terrorism, their very broad definition of terrorism are harmonized. So it's very difficult, because of the closed nature of these organizations, to measure the precise number of extraditions that have been facilitated through these organizations. We have various cases that we can point to, and I discuss in the chapter, from 2006, for example, where 11 Uzbek asylum seekers were forcefully returned from Ukraine to Uzbekistan under the Minsk Convention. We have a case in 2007 where 28 Uzbek asylum seekers again were extradited from Kazakhstan, again referring to the CIS legislation, and a further case in 2010 where a further 29 Uzbek asylum seekers were deported from Kazakhstan. So certainly we're seeing this being used. Just briefly on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, founded in 2001, emerged from border negotiations between China and the former Soviet states of Central Asia and Russia. eventually added more members, including India, Pakistan, and Uzbekistan to its membership. And ultimately, its primary mandate is to fight the three evils of terrorism, extremism, and separatism, which is lifted straight out of China's playbook on national security. Its 2005 concept of cooperation requires members to importantly mutually recognize terrorist, extremist, and separatist acts or groups, regardless of if their own legislation classifies them as such. Put simply, the law of one member state becomes the law of all. And so if an organization is recognized in Tajikistan, for example, the Islamic Renaissance Party, a former opposition group, is labeled a terrorist organization. In effect, it's labeled a terrorist organization by all of the member states. And in addition, they've developed very amorphous definitions of terrorism, extremism, and separatism that can be applied to all sorts of activists, opposition, potential opposition members. And this mutual recognition of terrorist and extremist individuals extends to a provision where they would be denied asylum. So if an individual who's accused of being a member of the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan tries to seek asylum in Russia or in Belarus, then they would be denied asylum based on this principle. And so we see ultimately through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, we see efforts to, again, bypass humanitarian law, to coordinate actions to target terrorists, so-called terrorists and extremists, and facilitate transnational repression. Like the Interpol and the CIS, it has its own list of organizations and individuals accused of terrorism, separatism, and extremism. This has grown from 42 organizations and 1,100 individuals back in 2010 to, by 2016, 2,500 individuals and 769 different groups, including many groups that are political opposition parties, such as Democratic Choice of Kazakhstan, or religious groups, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, banned within the organization. And there's a very simple process by which, if someone's on this list, that information is disseminated amongst members. Like the CIS, it's very difficult to measure precisely how many times the SCO is invoked in different extradition hearings, but combining various data points in the chapter, I come to a total of 770 individuals who've been who were extradited, returned through the SCO by 2017. But it remains unclear, especially given the issues of foreign fighters coming from the region, particularly Syria and Iraq, during that period. It's unclear how many of these individuals are genuine members of terrorist organizations or activists. In short, international organizations are conduits through which transnational repression takes place. They're essential in establishing, as Yana said, the legitimacy and in maintaining the regime security, particularly of powerful authoritarian states such as Russia and China, but also benefit the regimes of smaller states that have been very proactive in using transnational repression, such as Tajikistan. But I see that time is ticking away, so I'll hand back to Yana.
Great, thanks so much. Really great data there, and I'm sure you're paying attention to what we're increasingly seeing in Russia with some Central Asian former migrants who have actually gotten Russian citizenship, who are now being stripped of that citizenship and returned to face extensive jail terms and criminal trials. I think that's escalating and somewhat shocking to see, because some of these people have lived in Russia for 2 decades or more. So I was asked by the folks at the Orion Policy Institute to say a few words about Turkey. So I will do that, and I will then say a few words about policy responses, and I hope to continue the conversation with the other panelists about policy responses. So as Dana and others have mentioned, Freedom House has been working on the issue of transnational repression for a few years now. We have a data set where we track incidents. The data set, our latest version, which accounts for the years 2014 to 2021, the end of 2021 inclusive, now has 735 incidents of transnational repression, 36 countries as perpetrator governments across 84 countries in the world. of those 36 countries, Turkey is one, and it's an interesting one along with a few others because it is both a perpetrator of transnational repression, meaning that it commits transnational repression, but it is also a place where transnational repression happens. And so we call it both an origin and a host state. And so in our data set, we have 123 incidents that were perpetrated by Turkey. I think most people probably listening today will know that Turkey, the government of Turkey, led by President Erdogan, targets political opponents, especially those associated with the attempted coup, but also targets journalists and others, and has been responsible for a really impressive system of rendition, essentially kidnapping people and returning them. And also, unlike some of these other countries that perpetrate transnational repression, Turkey is actually quite proud of its campaign. And often you see a person disappear in one country and reappear in Turkey on state television as an example of someone who has been returned successfully and will face criminal charges. We also see that Turkey, as I mentioned after Dina was finished speaking, that people who are fleeing repression often have limited choices as to where they can go in the world. They are prevented often by borders and by migration systems from entering democracies, which are where transnational repression still takes place, but is often rarer, especially the physical cases of transnational repression, so the severest cases. Many people flee where they can, and that means that lots of people come to Turkey to seek some relief from the repression they're experiencing at home, and those include people fleeing from Central Asian states. They include Russians, they include Uyghurs coming from China, they also include Iranians and Egyptians and Saudis and others. Turkey has an interesting relationship with these people. For a long time, it has been quite protective of some of these individuals. So the Uyghurs, for example, there are special immigration pathways for the Uyghurs to establish themselves in Turkey. They have received some political protection as well. Early on, the Turkish government was one of the first in the world to point to the human rights violations against the Uyghurs inside China. We have seen something similar with the Egyptians and Iranians. Some Egyptians, some Iranians will receive a limited amount of protection in Turkey. We've seen plots essentially by the Iranian security services actually stopped by Turkish security services, and some people protected. But what we found in the research we did recently on policies of host states when it comes to protecting people against transnational repression is that countries like Turkey, and also in our case, Thailand, which is another country that both perpetrates transnational repression and is a host country, these countries often have a political approach to protecting people. So when the relationship between the host, the targeting government and the host country is positive or on the way up, the targeted communities become more vulnerable. So we saw this in Turkey over the last year with the Uyghurs. We also saw it with the Turkmen diaspora in Turkey. The relationship between Turkmenistan and Turkey and China and Turkey has improved. And so those communities became more vulnerable over time. We also saw something, I think, really interesting when it comes to the attitude of the Turkish government to the consequences of the assassination of Jamal Shogi. Of course, Jamal Shogi was murdered in a consulate in Turkey by what has been established to be the Saudi security services. And the Turkish government was out front, one of the first governments to lay responsibility for that at the Saudi government's feet, and also to take measures to kind of publicize what happened. And the Turkish authorities started a trial in the case of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and then very famously, just recently, they handed over that trial to Riyadh, effectively ending that investigation. And that comes as had a kind of coincided with a meeting between Erdogan and MBS and a kind of an improvement in the relationship between the Saudis and the Turkish government. The Saudis very famously, after the murder of Jamal Shogi had an unofficial boycott of Turkey in response to this criticism, and their relationship has improved over time, which is not great for anyone who is seeking protection from the Saudi government inside of Turkey. But as others on this panel have noted, we shouldn't lay the feet just at, or we shouldn't lay blame just at the feet of authoritarian regimes. Democratic countries, established democracies also have cooperation with authoritarian states that is driven by political considerations. One of the more famous cases from this year was the agreement between the UK government and Rwanda to return asylum seekers, or to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to relocate them, so that they will await the processing of their claims in Rwanda instead of in the UK. This is, of course, problematic because Rwanda has quite a poor human rights record. It's also a perpetrator of transnational repression, quite a prolific one. And so this is a way that the UK government chose to disregard various human rights concerns in favor of pursuing this politically expedient policy towards migration. We've seen cooperation when it comes to security and extradition between countries like Canada and China, and others. There's also security cooperation. And I think one of the, just to turn to solutions, and maybe we can brainstorm some solutions, I think one of the biggest problems around transnational repression is just how complex the tactics are. So Marcus and others have noted that often tactics build on each other, but also, as the other panelists have said, some of these tactics, or most of these tactics, take advantage of political concerns and narratives that are dominant in other countries, whether that's terrorism, whether that's xenophobia, whether that's other trade relationships, other interests. And so for those of us who are looking at solutions, we face this problem of a challenge that is very well networked, has lots of sharp edges when it comes to political considerations, and is deeply entrenched in some international institutions and organizations. And so I will open up the floor. Maybe if we can talk about something positive. I don't know if that's the right word in this context, but I'll ask my fellow panelists if they have seen any policies or responses or measures that diasporas themselves have taken, perhaps something that tech companies have done that have offered some measure of protection, or have pursued some kind of accountability for acts of transnational repression or the threat of transnational repression. And maybe we'll go in backwards order from the presentation. So Ed, I hate to put you on the spot. We'll start with you.
I think just in a general sense, and I'm speaking from being in Washington, DC, I think when we cast our minds back, maybe even just 5 years ago, transnational repression was very much at the periphery of, there were some news stories related to, the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. There were certain cases, of course, that reached the headlines. But I think what's happened over the past 5 years is really a raising of awareness to the extent that now this is really reaching policy circles as something that's on the agenda, something that, which is rare in Washington, has bipartisan buy-in, I think, from both sides, maybe even if the rationale of buying in is slightly different. I think we've seen, obviously, the State Department, for example, including transnational repression in some of their human rights reports as a separate section. We've seen the introduction and passing of the TRAP Act, which focuses on transnational repression and, sets out certain policies for the US to counter transnational repression in the United States and try and work to reform Interpol and prevent it from being used. Now, of course, there are limitations to all of these moves, but I think for me, the big positive has been that this is now something that's being talked about by policymakers. People are aware of it, as Mathieu said at the beginning of his presentation. It's certainly something that's reached the public consciousness and seeped into policymaking. So I think that's certainly beneficial as a starting point to for any policy to be enacted. People need to realize the stakes, and people need to take an interest, and I think that's happening.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ed. I should also say that we can talk about the upsides and downsides of the security response to transnational repression, but I'll note that the the FBI in the United States has actively started tracking incidents of transnational repression. And as I think my fellow social scientists on this panel will agree with me, that tracking data is the first step in actually making something a concern, right? You have to have evidence that this is a phenomenon that's taking place. Mathieu?
Yeah, Trap Act. That's what I wanted to say. So that's it. So yeah, the Trap Act is basically, it encourages, United States law enforcement to be mindful of these things and to exert its pressure, in as much as it can within Interpol. And that's actually one of the items that I pointed out too, is that so presently the response within Interpol has been to set up this review commission, or is it CCF, but that is operated by Interpol itself. So it is it's not an external supervisory body. It is internal, and it is set up in the headquarters, and the members of the commission are selected by the General Assembly. So it is Interpol policing itself. Well, that's not a bad thing, but it obviously has certain limitations. Like, for instance, one of the principles of that commission is that it has to start from the assumption that any request for assistance to Interpol is legitimate until proven otherwise. Yeah, well, that is maybe that is a smart thing to do, because I'm assuming that most requests will be legitimate. But if you're a supervisory body, I don't think that's how you should get into the situation. But of course, then my response to it is that second, we need an external form of supervision. I have to immediately say, I have no idea where that would be placed, maybe in the United Nations. I don't know what that would look like. Maybe they can ask me to be one of the academic representatives of the body, but I'm obviously not an international law enforcement expert. So there would have to be experts on it, maybe teachers. I know several law enforcement, most all the law enforcement officers, all the law enforcement officers that I have come to know, these are really serious, dedicated people. They're very professional. These people work with very, very serious international criminal incidents. They tend to be very sociable people, I always notice, which I think is very interesting from a sociological point of view in terms of network building, because a lot of international policing goes from the ground up. All these initiatives have emerged from the ground up, and that's why Interpol came about as a purely practical initiative. But I do think at this point, if you want to have 195 nations represented, you're asking for an external body. Then the other part that I want to echo from Ed is indeed the public discussion, which now has also reached the political level. So the Trap Act was a bipartisan initiative. Senator Roger Wicker and Ben Cardin took the lead in that. So this is something in this day and age, when something is really bipartisan, that's a good sign that there are serious interest involved in all of this, right? And then finally, the argument I wanted to make is it is also up to the participating police themselves to not have their shield tarnished, so to speak, by these cops from other countries that maybe are only cops in name, that are police in name only, but that in actuality are much, much closer to being representatives of the government rather than representatives of law enforcement.
That's great. Thank you, Mathieu. Not to be a Debbie Downer on the Trap Act and Interpol in the US, I will say that one of the frustrations I've had in looking into this issue, and I'm not an immigration expert, but one of the frustrations is that the Department of Justice has guidance on the use of Interpol notices in the US, but because that guidance says they can't use it to arrest, you can't use red notices to arrest people, it effectively says, well, that means that we don't use red notices to arrest people. And of course, that discounts how red notices are used in the immigration system, not the criminal system. So definitely, but I agree with both Mathieu and Ed that this has become a conversation in policy circles in a way that hasn't happened before. So I'll turn it to Dana. Dana, it's up to you what you want to focus on. I am super interested to hear more about what it means to have social capital and how that helps people withstand transnational repression, because I think next on the agenda for policymakers is how to empower communities to be able to withstand this.
Yes, thank you. And this response also, this folds in one of the questions we've received in the Q&A, which is how can we empower diaspora associations, community organizations writ large? I think the FBI move to actually start tracking, dogs. Hush dogs, sorry. The FBI moved to start tracking and and being available to people to talk about the fact that they recognize this is important. But we also need to recognize that as persecuted racial, ethnic, religious minorities in place, especially in places like the United States, where we've had this huge crackdown on irregular migration, that a lot of those communities have not only language barriers to talk to law enforcement, but also legitimate fears of law enforcement. And so I think we need more intermediary coordination. One of the ways that diaspora organizations or diaspora individuals gain social capital is when they have organizational and institutional backing. That could be their university. It could be, as Marcus and I talk about in our new article, if journalists have the support of the BBC or the other kinds of organizations that they work for. A lot of times they aren't necessarily able to stop transnational repression from happening. That tends to be out of people's control, but at least to have the backing legally, emotionally, psychologically, and socially, sometimes even economically and financially, to deal with some of the ramifications, oftentimes to name and shame regimes for these practices, because regimes will often say, well, if you play by our rules, then nothing will happen to your families, but then things happen to their families anyway, right? So we need more publicization of these things. So that's going to require universities becoming more aware of the kinds of infiltration and monitoring of student groups, really supporting and defending students' freedom of speech. That's going to require, I think, any sort of state of subsidy funding of different diaspora organizations in places like the UK, contingent on democratic processes within that organization, truly elected leaders, diverse representation, so that regime loyalists and officials can't co-opt those organizations. And I think there also needs to be more outreach. Of course, there always needs to be more outreach to at-risk communities, but local law enforcement are oftentimes very responsive to folks when they raise these issues, but they don't know about transnational repression, right? They're not reading the scholarly literature on this. So at the local level, the people who actually interact with these community members day to day do need more awareness. Transnational repression may be obvious to us, right? But even when I talk to immigration scholars in sociology, a lot of them don't know about it, right? Much less like police on the ground. So we need definitely more awareness raising and training about how to properly refer these cases so that they can be counted and they can be managed. The last thing I'll say is that my colleague Don Picard and I, who is a lawyer and is an attorney with expertise in international law, we're going to be putting out a chapter on how human rights advocates can actually use certain international law principles, not only to sanction regimes, who should, by the way, be having human rights tied up with economic packages, aid, arms sales. I mean, this should be happening anyway, right? And it's not, which is very frustrating. But how folks can leverage international law to hold regimes accountable, but also how states can get fiscal remuneration from regimes who are committing acts of transnational repression on their soil and violating their sovereignty. So I think there's a lot of tools that still need to be unpacked that we can use, but we still, I think, are in some of the awareness building phase. But I'm delighted that, policymakers are starting to respond favorably, at least in places like the United States. But democracies have very contradictory and paradoxical relationships with authoritarian regimes, with migration. So this is complicating things.
Thanks for that, Dana. Yeah, I fully agree. I think on the international stage, so let's take a sec to plug an event that's happening on the sidelines of the UN Human Rights Council next week. Actually, I will be on a panel with representatives from two UN working groups. And I should say that the working groups on arbitrary disappearance and detention have actually begun to note the cross-national or cross-border role that governments play in sort of abducting people in a new way recently. So that's positive. A couple of things I'll just throw out also, I think definitely conditioning security assistance with an eye to transnational repression is something that's important. Looking at the role of diplomats and embassies in terms of perpetrating transnational repression. I mean, the states have the power to designate, persona non grata, to not issue diplomatic visas, and those are not things that are currently being used widely to respond to transnational repression. So with 5 minutes to go, I'm going to give Marcus the last word in terms of responses, and then anything else you want to wrap us up with, Marcus.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, in terms of positive examples or constraining digital transnational repression, I will focus again on this one to stay within my turf. I think the most important, important examples for combating digital transnational repression come from investigative journalism, civil society research, exposing the companies, the tools that are used, the methods, how to say, not neutralizing some of their tools. Yeah, and if we think about the example of Pegasus, of the Pegasus spyware and NSO group, they are now really struggling for survival because of investigative research by journalists and civil society. And I think these initiatives are important and need more support, also cooperation with the private sector, like the tech private sector, because they have an interest to expose these tools or to combat these companies, because it undermines their platforms, the security of their platforms and their tools. And they have also a lot of resources that could be useful for civil society. So we have seen, for instance, the example of Apple then pledging support to the Citizen Lab and other units, civil society organizations investigating working on digital security. So we need more of these examples. This is also important for support. You mentioned digital hygiene, networks of sharing information on threats, digital threats against civil society. So often people I talk to, they told me that they still feel alone in combating digital threats and setting up their own security. So they need to have first aid helplines, which are already in place but need to be expanded, and so that people know where to go to and have the support they need. And in terms of the host state governments, I think we need a shift in perception and in practice, of the issue, because they see it is often transnational repression is framed as a human rights violation, which is of course correct and important to do so, but perhaps it's also useful to see it as a kind of as undermining, as Dana did in her presentation, undermining the rule of law, the security and democratic processes in the host states, and ultimately threatening in a way their sovereignty, undermining their sovereignty. So if they shift their perception a bit, then they would see also the interest in protecting these communities against the authoritarian practices that follow them from abroad. And counterintelligence measures could also be put in place to protect these communities better, or to reach out and work together with them. I leave it at that. There's certainly, it's important to continue discussing these responses and mitigation strategies, and we will do so, I think. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marcus. I think that everything was spot on. I think the recognition that this is transnational repression is a human rights threat, but it's also a threat to democratic institutions. It's a threat to national security. These are we've seen examples in the U.S. where that's been elevated. And also recognizing that people who flee authoritarianism, just because you cross a border doesn't mean you've escaped the grasp of autocrats. And so that's something for civil society groups, I think, also to consider, who are offering immediate support. So with that, I will thank Marcus, Mathieu, Dana, Ed, the folks at the Orion Policy Institute for this great discussion. And feel free to reach out to any of us with questions, and I hope to see you all soon again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yana, for your expert moderation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.